Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone for the keynote address today. We are honored to have Ahmed Mushfiq Mobarak as the keynote speaker of the CESLAM Kathmandu Migration Conference 2020, organized by the Center for the Study of Labor and Mobility CESLAM and Social Science Baha. Mushfiq Mobarak is a professor of economics at Yale University with concurrent appointments in the School of Management and in the Department of Economics. Professor Mobarak is the founder and faculty director of the Yale Research Initiative on Innovation and Scale, YRISE. He holds other appointments at Innovations for Poverty Action, the Jameel Poverty Action Lab at MIT, and the International Growth Center at LSE. Professor Mobarak has several ongoing research projects in Bangladesh, Brazil, Chile, Kenya, Malawi, and Sierra Leone. He conducts field experiments exploring ways to induce people in developing countries to adopt technologies or behaviors that are likely to be welfare improving. He also examines the complexities of scaling up development interventions that are proven effective in such trials. For example, he's scaling and testing strategies to address seasonal poverty using migration subsidies or consumption loans in Bangladesh, Nepal, and Indonesia. His research has been published in journals across disciplines, including Econometrica, Science, the Review of Economic Studies, the American Political Science Review, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and Demography, and he has also been covered by the New York Times, The Economist, Science, NPR, BBC, Wall Street Journal, The Times of London, and other media outlets around the world. He received a Carnegie Fellowship in 2017. Professor Mobarak is collaborating with the government of Bangladesh, NGOs, and think tanks such as BRAC and BIGD, the major Bangladeshi telecom providers, Innovations for Poverty Action, UNDP, other economists, epidemiologists, computer scientists, and public health researchers to devise evidence-based COVID response strategies for Bangladesh and for other developing countries. Professor Mobarak is part of a study conducted by a joint research team of the Yale Research Initiative of Innovation and Scale and CESLAM in Kathmandu, which tracked 2,600 households in rural Nepal over 5 rounds of surveys during both the lean and harvest seasons before and after the COVID-19 lockdown. So the title of the keynote address today is Migration and the Labor Market Impacts of COVID-19. So Professor Mobarak will speak for 30 minutes, and then we will have a question and answer session. So today we already have 99 participants, and I'm sure we're going to be having a lot more. So over to you, Professor Mobarak.
Thank you, Sambriddhi, for that very nice, long introduction. That was very kind. First of all, thanks to CESLAM for organizing this event and for inviting me to it. So I'm especially happy today that I get to talk about work that I'm doing in collaboration with Arjun Kharel, who's also in the room, and with others at YRISE and at CESLAM. It's truly a sort of a joint project collaborative effort that started a couple of years ago, and we've just continued our work after even after COVID started. Of course, the modality has changed to more sort of phone-based interactions as opposed to in-person interactions in the Western Terai area of Nepal. And I'll just say, yeah, since Arjun is also in the room, if there are some difficult questions on at least the Nepal part of what I talk about, he will be answering all the difficult questions. I will be talking about data from both Bangladesh and from Nepal. So with that, let me just share my screen. And I will launch right into a discussion of mobility, migration, labor market impacts of the COVID crisis. And in the 30 minutes, I'll try to just give you a flavor for what we're learning about how migrant families are experiencing this COVID crisis and whether it's different from non-migrant families. It turns out, surprisingly, normally, households that have opportunities for migration and they have opportunities to earn income elsewhere, often in labor markets that are much, pay higher wages than rural labor markets. So normally they do a lot better. But what we're learning is that these are the families, these migrant-dependent families or remittance-dependent families, are experiencing the crisis right now much more acutely than other families. And so let me show you the data on that. But before I jump into the main topic of today's lecture about migration and the effects of COVID on migrant families, I'd like to give you an overall sense of sort of how we started collecting data in order to support government policy responses for COVID. So a lot of our work is in Bangladesh, and that's where I'm from, and have sort of strong connections there. But we also have been interacting with various policymakers in Nepal and in Sierra Leone and Nigeria as well. So just a quick overview of the various things that we're doing. Right? The first thing is that in countries in South Asia, like it was very clear, even when COVID started hitting, like late March, early April, that when COVID comes, we're not going to have the same type of sophisticated data infrastructure that countries like South Korea or Taiwan can use to track the disease and to devise policy responses. So we needed to figure out how do we get data that's that's going to be much more indirect, and that will allow us to make indirect inferences about the prevalence of the disease, where it's growing, and how to devise policy responses. And so what we did in Bangladesh for many samples that we were tracking anyway, we continued tracking them post-COVID with phone surveys to understand not only the public health dimensions of the crisis, in terms of our disease symptoms showing up in various parts of the country, and public health behaviors, mask wearing, and social distancing, etc.
Yeah.
But also, it was
Professor Mobarak, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but there have been complaints that the audio is not clear. Is there any way to improve the sound?
Sure. It's good.
I'm sorry for interrupting. But
No problem at all. It's good that we figured this out. Because you have I'm using the wrong. Okay, is that any better?
yes, I think so. Thank you.
Yeah. If somebody in the chat could confirm that it's better, then I'll keep talking about if I don't. Okay, looks like there's a lot of chat coming through. Yes, better. Okay, great. Thank you for confirming. And okay, so just I'm going to do a 30-second recap of what I just said. Apologies to those who couldn't hear. So my 30-second recap is that prior, as soon as COVID hit, right, one of the first things that we started doing was to collect data in the absence of really good sophisticated data that countries like South Korea, Taiwan might have, right? We needed to start collecting, any kind of survey information that we could on like disease prevalence, where the disease is spreading, where are migrants coming back, because we knew migrants were going to carry the disease back, right? Because it spreads through human to human transmission. Public health behaviors, knowledge, mask using, social distancing. But also, it was also very clear that this crisis was going to soon become an economic crisis in addition to a public health one. So it was important for us to get a handle of that. So we started collecting data on people's employment, income shocks, right? What are they doing with their time? Are they earning money? And what's happening to food insecurity? Are people getting enough to eat? Food shortages? Are food prices going up? Et cetera, right? So it's important for us to have that data. So in Bangladesh, we did it all over the country. In Nepal, we were able to do this in some western districts in the Terai region, because that's where we already had access to samples. Okay. And Sierra Leone, we're also doing it all over the country. So that's the first piece is data collection. Okay. And the second piece I'll talk about down here is that we had been talking a lot about making decisions on the basis of epidemiological models, right? Like for example, the Imperial College model was the basis for a lot of decisions that the US and UK made early, right? But especially in developing countries, right, where there's also a concern that if you enforce social distancing and the economic distancing that goes along with that, you can really harm people's livelihoods, right? You can, you and I mean, even people like us, we can, whether in the US or in urban Nepal, we can sit back in front of our computers and get work done. But that's not true for a day wage laborer in rural Nepal, right? If he doesn't earn some money that week, it might be the case that his family goes hungry, right? And so we also need to understand, how to model the effects of this crisis, not only on the public health side, but also on the economic side and the behavioral side. And the reason is that if you try to impose social distancing, people whose families are going hungry, they're not going to be able to abide by those guidelines anyway, right? So we need to get a more comprehensive understanding. We do need to bring together both the public health insights as well as some economics and behavioral insights. Okay? And another thing that we did this both in Nepal and Bangladesh, is that we started, given that we were making thousands of phone calls in order to collect information from people, right? We allocated some of those phone calls to try and also deliver information. So can we identify some important people who can then pass on the information to their friends and neighbors, right? So that could be just regular people, or it could be like imams at mosques, or it could be school headmasters, like people who have credibility that others would listen to, okay? And then, and I'll show you something about this, like using migration patterns in order to make inferences about where the disease is likely to spread. And finally, right now, we're doing some large-scale projects, specific projects to try out specific policy responses. So to give you one example, we are in Bangladesh, we're now distributing about 1.5 million masks in 700 communities and running it as a randomized control trial to try and learn how do we set up a mass distribution system plus the enforcement and monitoring and collaboration with leaders in order to change social norms around mask wearing at the community level, right? So the first step is to understand how to get people to consistently use and wear masks correctly with the proper mask with the right material for an entire community. And the second step, if that succeeds, is to then test how does that reduce COVID transmission. And we have to do some sort of serological testing in order to track COVID transmission. Okay, so that gives you an overview of like after COVID hit, what was our thinking with respect to how do we support government policy responses by generating some evidence that might be useful. Okay, and in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about all of this. This is why I'm starting with it. But what I'm going to do right now is just focus on one aspect of the issue, which is on migration, given that this is a talk at the Center for Study of Labor and Migration. Okay? Okay, so let's get into that. So why focus on migration? Okay. And the reason is that in Nepal and other countries, other low and middle income countries around the world, migration forms a really important part of people's economic livelihoods. Okay. And migration is, of course, something that is differentially affected during this COVID period because movement has been limited, right? So if people are dependent on migration for their livelihood and mobility is limited, then of course you're going to have a big problem on your hands. Okay? So these are just numbers from various countries around the world. This is the number right on top in Nepal, right? So what you see is that the subpopulation we're studying, which are like poor, near landless households working in agriculture in rural Nepal, right? We see that like 2/3 of those households regularly engage in migration as part of their livelihood strategy. Right? So in rural districts of Nepal in the west, 2/3 of families actually have a migrant. And these migrants, sometimes of course, we know about migrants who go to the Middle East, to Qatar, etc., right? But the typical profile of a migrant here is maybe about half of them is some, people who would go to Indian cities to work seasonally and then come back. Okay? And the other profile is, of course, people from rural Nepal who are going to Nepali cities for work. Okay? So you also see very high rates of migration in northern Bangladesh, an area that, agroecologically is similar to Nepal, right? In India, in parts of Africa, etc. And the other thing to note is that like this is true for low and middle income countries, and in the U.S., the
the rate of migration as part of people's livelihood strategy is actually very, very low. Okay. And the second thing I wanted to point out here is that when we have data from both countrywide versus these particular subpopulations, you see huge gaps, which suggests that migration as a livelihood strategy is concentrated among certain identifiable subgroups, right? So if you need to devise policy, that's helpful because then you know exactly what are the subpopulations that we need to target with such policies, okay? And so who are these subgroups? They're typically poor and often rural, and their migration rates is like 2 or 3 times the national average. Okay? And then another point that I'll make here. So now here, these graphs, these dots here, are now the subset of the total migration that is seasonal in nature, meaning it's not permanent migration, not people who are away for the entire year, but people who are moving back and forth between urban and rural areas, right? So people go to Indian cities for some months and come back, or people go to Nepali cities for some months and then come back to the rural area, like during the harvest, Dashain festival and things. So that also means that, you know, it's not only identifiable subpopulations, but also identifiable times of the year, right? Which might also be helpful for policy guidance, okay? Exactly what times of the year are people engaging in migration? When has COVID hit? Is COVID really hitting them at a time when they otherwise would be away and earning money? Versus is COVID hitting at a fortunate period where, you know, it doesn't really affect them too much, right? All right, and so why certain times of the year? Because people migrate when local opportunities in rural areas become scarce, right? So this is often related to agricultural crop cycle, which means that like after the planting, but before the harvest, there's less to do in the rural area. So wages fall during that period in rural areas, so people migrate during that period, right? But after the harvest, or during and after the harvest, they usually come back, okay? But what's happened during the COVID crisis is that people have been forced back early. So in the first 2 weeks in April, especially with India's lockdown, a lot of Nepalis were suddenly forced back. And that early return might mean that they haven't built up the savings that they would normally build up during this migration period. And this might be something that affects their life in the near future. All right, so now let me get into some empirical results, okay? And so I'm just first putting up the different samples that we studied. So there is the Nepali sample that I've talked to you a little bit about, right? But there are 3 different samples that we're studying from Bangladesh as well. So this sample, no mean season, is it's very similar to the Nepali sample in that these are landless, rural agricultural households that send seasonal migrants to Bangladeshi cities. So unlike India and Nepal, our border with India is not open. So Bangladeshi migrants typically, stay within the country in Bangladeshi cities. And then we also have some data from the area where the Rohingya refugees recently arrived. So Bangladesh saw an influx of about 1 million Rohingya refugees from Burma from July 2017 onwards. And so we collected data in the refugee camps, but also in the area surrounding the refugee camps to see how the locals were also affected by the presence of refugees. And then finally, there's another very important, interesting migrant sample that I will start with. So until now, I've talked a lot about sort of internal migration, seasonal migration, but of course, there's another important type of migration, which is international migration, okay? It's a different type of household that participates in international migration. And here what happened was the Bangladesh and Malaysia had a government-to-government G2G agreement for Malaysia to take some Bangladeshi workers to have them work in palm oil plantations, usually in Malaysia. Okay? So they were going to issue, this happened in 2013, they were going to issue about 10,000 visas. And when the Bangladeshi government advertised that opportunity, over 1.4 million people applied. And so many applications with only 10,000 visas, the Bangladesh government decided to run a lottery, right? So which is really useful because then what our job was, since then, we've tracked down all lottery participants or a representative sample of lottery participants, people who won the lottery as well as people who lost the lottery, right? So that's useful because people who won the lottery became much higher likelihood of migrants. But for those of you who are, empirical economics oriented, you understand identification problems, right? The lottery is really useful because now we have basically a randomized control trial where there were some winners and some losers in the lottery, lucky and unlucky people, who are identical, except that one won the lottery. So it gives you really clean data on what the effects of migration are. Okay. So those are the samples that we'll study, and I'm going to start with this one. Okay, what's happening to the sample of international migrants? Okay. So what you find is that year after year, so hold aside April 2022 for now, and let's talk first about like what have we observed since 2013. Okay, so as we've been tracking these lottery winners versus lottery losers, lottery winners being people who had higher likelihood of going to Malaysia. Okay. What we find is that lottery winners are every year they are much better off. Okay, so makes sense. You know, you get access to a much richer labor market, right? Those families do much better. So we observe year after year that they earn a lot more. Some years like 20% more, but some years like 100% more. They're doubling their income. And then what's happening to their families? They're eating better. They're also like investing more in housing, building up assets. They are less indebted, right? They make more loans, take fewer loans, etc. So these families are doing a lot better, which is not surprising. Okay. However, when we go back and survey these households, both the winners and losers in April of 2020, right? You see that the lottery winners actually experienced a much larger economic shock than the losers. Okay. And then there are more, in fact, there are more lottery winners, right? Who are reporting, like those households are more likely to report like complete unemployment and zero income, okay, compared to lottery losing households. So the shock seemed larger in among sort of migrant households, okay. And this is not only true in that particular sample, right? You also see, you know, in Nepal, this is like in 2019 during the rice harvest period, right? In October 2019, like, you know, the households with migrants, the red is migrants, right? They generally do a lot better. They have more income, but they face a larger shock. Okay, the decrease for the households with migrants is larger than the decrease for households without. But of course, everybody faced a shock during this COVID period, right? So big news is that these numbers are much smaller for everyone. The second piece of news is that it's relatively even a larger shock for the migrant households. And if you look at food insecurity, you see the same. So this is what food insecurity looked like for households with and without migrants in 2018 and 2019, okay, before COVID. But if you compare food insecurity now in April of 2020, there's a huge jump up for households that had migrants, right, as opposed to households without migrants, right? So we're getting a consistent picture across all the samples that you know, income shocks are larger for migrant families, and food insecurity are also larger for migrant families, right? So normally you might think of as migrant families as doing generally better, but this was kind of the opposite situation right now during this COVID period, right? Of course, you know, here I should distinguish a little bit between international migrants versus internal migrants, because the internal migrants, you know, these are much more migration out of desperation. These are very, very poor people, right? Whatever they earn in the migration destination, they have to eat, right? They don't save, they don't get to save up too much, right? So these guys are really suffering. Whereas the international migrants, even though the current income shock is lower, they have, of course, over the last 7-10 years, they have built up some assets, right? So even though income shock is larger, they probably have a little bit easier time to actually cope with the shock right now. All right, so now the bottom line is that across samples, we see that migrant families seem to face larger shocks. Now, why is that happening? So next we look at, okay, exactly what is the type of income that has the most negative shock. So here, this is, the red is lottery winners and the gray is lottery losers, right? And what I have on the left side is remittance income. And what I have on the right side is all other sources of income, non-remittance income, okay? So what you see clearly, whether you're a lottery winner or not, remittance income drops. It's like over here, remittance income drops a lot more than non-remittance income. Okay. So for lottery losers, that's not true. It's comparable, statistically comparable, but the coefficient is larger and more negative for the for non-remittance side. But for lottery winners, like people who had migrated, it's clearly the case that those guys are suffering a lot, like because their remittance income has dropped. Okay, so that's in Bangladesh, and let's see what happens in Nepal with remittance income. So this is total remittance income across time. So you see, you know, this is the COVID period, like April of 2020, right? So we collected data after COVID, But this is the same sample of households that, thanks to our collaboration with CESLAM, we have been tracking over time. So in 2019, September, October, November, December, we had been tracking these households. So this is what happens to their remittance income. You see that over different seasons, there's some variation. So depending on when people are coming back, when they're leaving, et cetera, right? So there's some variation. But here's what happened after COVID. There's a sharp drop, okay? So in late 2019, the average household received about almost 5,000 Nepali rupees, right? But in the last month, right, this has fallen to, sorry, last month I mean June, July, this has fallen to about 1,700 Nepali rupees in terms of remittance income. So that's where it's coming from. This is why migrant families are suffering more. Okay, so next, let's dig a little bit deeper. So we've said migrant families are suffering more, bigger income shocks because remittance income is falling. Now, the question is, why is remittance income falling? There's actually two reasons in the data. So number one is that many people who would normally be away and earning money and sending remittances home, they were suddenly forced to return in the first 2 weeks of April, okay? So this is a graph of the share of households in our sample that we have been tracking since 2019, share households with a male who's away, who's a migrant, okay? So you see again, in 2019, before COVID, there's seasonal variation, right? People are more likely to be away in the pre-harvest season. They come back home for the rice harvest and the festivals, right? And then they go away again. So this is the variation you see in general. And then this dropped to a level that you would normally not expect to drop during this period. Okay? So a lot of migrants were forced to return home, and that's why they're not earning money. And that's true in Nepal. You also see for internal migrants in Bangladesh, right, that there is a jump up again of return. So this is the 2020 return. So this is like what we would expect in terms of departure dates and return dates. This is the seasonal variation you expect. And look what happens to returns in 2020. Right? It's a huge jump up relative to any normal year that we have been tracking for the last few years. Okay. So lots of migrants returning. That's the first reason why. That's the first reason why remittance income has dropped, and therefore migrants are suffering more. The second reason is that even the migrants who are away are currently sending less money back. So here, what I've plotted is remittances per adult male who's away, right? So per migrant, how much money are you getting? Okay. So this is the seasonal variation, right? People normally send like something like 4,600 rupees. That's what the average is across the year, and this has suddenly dropped to about 2,000 rupees. Okay? And this is data from Nepal again. So two reasons are that migrants are less likely to be away; they were forced to return, and second is that they're not doing as well in the destination; they're sending less money back. Okay? All right, so now let's talk a little bit about policy. So the question is, okay, so what do you do about the fact that so many people were forced to return? So there's two possibilities. So one is that you can try to reintegrate them into the local economy in rural Nepal, right? Or the other possibility is that you can try to repatriate them back to the destination country, right? If there are people who are forced back from the Middle East, right? Nepalese earn a lot over there and send a lot of remittances. As we know, over 20% of Nepali GDP is remittances. Okay? So you'd want to send them back. Okay, so now let's talk about reintegration as a possibility. Okay, is it possible for us to get all these migrants who've suddenly come back and somehow prop up the local economy? Okay, now we already know from the existing literature that there's a lot of barriers to reintegration. And so those barriers take the form of one, skill transferability, which is like if somebody is working year after year in a different labor market, that requires a very different skill because the type of job that a Nepali does in Qatar may not be the same job that's available at home, right? So their skills are not going to be as useful in this new local economy, right? So that's one traditional barrier. And the second barrier is that, of course, as migrants are away, they don't have the same kind of social and economic networks that allows for better job connections between employers and employees and things like that. So those are barriers. But on top of that, something we're observing during this COVID period is another new barrier that's come up, which is that migrants are facing a lot of stigma. Okay, so it's people understand that migrants have brought the disease into the country, right? And so there's stigma around associating with them. So we see a lot of this in our data, that they're less likely to be included in the social gatherings, right, et cetera, right? And in southern Bangladesh, we see that people with COVID symptoms are much more likely to be denied medical treatment, right, if they travel in the past 2 weeks, okay? So there's stigma. Now, is the stigma fair? Is it real? Unfortunately, what we also find in the data, because we also collected all this public health and disease surveillance data, and that what we find is areas that have more migrants. So let's say you have a community that has a returning migrant in the past 2 weeks. So compare a person's report there to another community where there's no returning migrant, okay? And what you find is that the communities where there's more, there's a returning migrant, the disease symptom prevalence is much, much higher, right? So many more people are likely to be reporting fever, dry cough, fatigue, right? We see in some subpopulations that, like the Rohingya refugee camps, for example, that your likelihood of reporting symptoms doubles or triples if you have a returning migrant, okay? So the stigma that got created is something that's stemming from something real, which is that when you have a returning migrant, they're the ones who brought the disease back to the community, okay? So therefore, it's going to be really difficult for us to overcome that. So all that is to say that reintegration has a lot of challenges, right? So I think what we need to think carefully about instead of reintegration is repatriation back to the destination countries. But that is also challenging because, you know, we might need to think carefully about, okay, what is it that the destination country wants? Like, do they, to feel comfortable to bring, to let Nepalese or Bangladeshis back into their country, right? The migrant workers. So we know, for example, in Singapore, like all of the disease now is just in these like dormitories where the migrants live, right? And then there's been issues like in Bangladesh, you know, there was a company that was just charging $30 to provide a COVID-free certificate. So a bunch of Bangladeshi workers showed up in Italy, like returned to Italy where they were working before. With their COVID-free certificate, they got tested, and we learned that they actually had COVID. And then there was, like, in one of the major Italian newspapers on the front page, there was this news story about how Bangladeshis are bringing the disease back, right? So we can't have situations like that. Otherwise, you know, these migration corridors are going to get shut down. So we need to understand, you know, working with maybe the foreign ministry through diplomatic channels, through the embassies, what is it that that these destination countries want? Do they want, you know, people to be quarantined? Do they want plausible, credible testing infrastructure, right? Can we provide those facilities and say that, yes, we're taking our migrant workers, we're testing them, we're quarantining them, and only then we're letting them get on the plane, right? So we need to think about strategies like that. Okay, and then this, one thing I'll say on the data side is that this link between migrant returns and disease prevalence is really strong. It's so strong, in fact, that in Bangladesh, what you can do is, I'll show you this map, you can create an index of, like, by sub-district in Bangladesh, that's this map, you can create an index of the, how, you know, basically your risk exposure to global COVID, right? By looking at where did migrants leave from? These are the, like, districts where there are more immigrants, more people leaving to countries like Italy or Singapore, because those are the ones who will return, right? So then you can create an index of, like, COVID risk just based on migration patterns, right? And in fact, and then this is the fit as to our COVID risk exposure on the x-axis, plotted against the subsequent distress calls to the government hotline that came from those sub-districts, right? And it's a really good fit. So basically, migration patterns are predictive of future distress calls and future quarantines, right? So migration is also helpful for us to sort of generate indirect data on where COVID is likely to be more of a problem. Okay, okay, and then here's a final thing I'll say, and then I'll stop. And the issue I want to mention here is that, as we've already discussed, economic livelihoods are quite seasonal in rural Nepal and rural Bangladesh, okay? So there's a lean season, which is typically the pre-harvest period, okay? And what you see is, like, this black line is food insecurity in a regular year, okay? So what you see is in 2019, right, those are the blue dots, like 2019 to 2020, this season, right? 2019, the blue dots sit right on top of the black line, right? Meaning 2019 was a similar year as to any other year in terms of food insecurity. But here's what happened in April 2020, right? Now the blue dots are much higher than the black line, okay? So it's already the case that during a period when food insecurity in rural Nepal is not so bad, we already saw excess food insecurity, right? So the part that I'm really concerned about is as we're heading into the lean season period where you have both the COVID shock, this excess food insecurity, on top of this hump here, right? Is this combination going to be much worse, right? So this requires policymakers' attention to think about how in rural areas, food insecurity, like regular food insecurity in any given year, is going to interact with the COVID situation. Okay? So that's true in Nepal. It's actually also true in Bangladesh. We see this, and then finally we can combine these two insights, so the seasonality part and the migration part, to show that the red are households with migrants, the black dots are households without migrants. The households without migrants during this COVID period in Bangladesh don't seem to be that badly affected relative to a regular year, but the households with migrants are the ones that are causing this, that seem to be responsible for this excess food insecurity. Okay. So let me stop there. So we've talked about migration, we've talked about seasonality, and this here we've talked about the combination of the two. And I'm happy to take questions. Sambriddhi, are you going to manage the questions, or? I don't know if anybody's talking, but everyone's on mute.
I think we lost her, so we'll wait for her. We can start taking.
And were the questions, I'm just trying to, were they coming in through the chat window or no?
Yeah,
They're not.
Q&A chat. So there's one question already there, so you can.
Okay. Oh, there's a Q&A button. Okay, so I'm going to open up the Q&A and try to get through the question while we wait for somebody. So it says, Professor Mobarak, how did you mitigate that high frequency data collection wasn't intrusive on top of the already seemingly personal private data that was being collected? Was the dropout rate of the participants? Okay, so it's a question about, there's a question about data collection, you know, that we're doing high frequency data collection. Is that too intrusive? Because we're asking a lot of sort of personal private information. Yeah. So I would say, you know, this is a sample that we have been following for a while. It's also the case that not only are we collecting data, we're also running some interventions in those areas. So for example, as Arjun can describe in more detail, providing seasonal consumption loans as we wait for the migrants to come back, right? So these are households that we have been talking to for a while and on a monthly basis. And they're actually quite, I mean, generally speaking, of course, there are some small incentives involved when we impose on their time, but they have been quite happy to talk to us, and we have had very low attrition. And in fact, phone surveys have been, if anything, much less intrusive than the in-person data collection activity that researchers normally do. And the reason is, in the phone surveys, we've had to keep things very tight, and we only talk to them for about 20-25 minutes of their time. Okay, and then there was a question, I guess it came earlier, about how to make sure that migrant returnees could rejoin to get their job back. Yeah, so, you know, the way to think about it is that when a Nepali migrant was working in the Middle East, say in Qatar, okay, there was a reason why they were there. Like, there was demand for that worker, right? There's Qataris and UAE and Saudi Arabia, they need those workers, right? And the question that we have to solve is that, okay, that job a lot of those jobs still exist, right? But we do need to make those employers feel comfortable to have the worker back, such that they feel comfortable that the worker is not going to become a vector for disease, right? And those are the conditions that we need to work on. And I think if we can make destination countries, employers feel comfortable that we have, this is a country that has handled coronavirus or has the infrastructure in place to identify and isolate like healthier people and send them, then that's going to be the necessary first step. Okay, can you provide the link to the work that's already published? So I'll just say, if you go to, so there is a paper that, everything I'm talking about, there's one paper that's under submission, actually two papers under submission to journals, but it's also the case that we've summarized those papers in news outlets like in Foreign Policy magazine. And we also wrote up an op-ed in one of the Nepali newspapers. And so if you go to yrise.yale.edu, and you'll see a link for COVID-19, and we're trying to put all of our papers there. yrise.yale.edu. Curious to know what software you use to create charts. It's data. For food insecurity in rural area, what might be the initiatives that government can take? So, okay, so there was a question, I guess, from a compatriot in Bangladesh. So what do we do about food insecurity? Rather than going into depth over this, I would encourage you, if you go on my website, you can read a lot of some of the things that we have tried, which is providing some seasonal migration subsidies, right? So it turns out that like during the lean season, when there's not much to do in the rural area, there are jobs that you can get in Bangladesh in urban areas, like rickshaw pulling or construction sector work, or even in other rural areas, like you move from the rice areas to like potato growing areas, you can find work during that period, right? And there is quite a bit of data that we've been collecting for the last 10 years with indications that if you facilitate the seasonal migration, that can improve food security for lots of poor rural agricultural households. So that's one strategy. And there are other strategies that governments have used. So things like rural work guarantee programs. Like India has a big program called NREGA, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. But then when we've had, in Malawi, they had a program like this, and a rigorous evaluation of the program suggests that that didn't quite work well. But there's ideas out there, and there's and there's some evidence on whether things are working. And then in Nepal, I have to say that we came into Nepal in this project with CESLAM thinking, oh, the Bangladesh migration facilitation, maybe that's something that would work in Nepal. But what we learned is that in Nepal, most people are already migrating. This is part of their strategy, right? So we don't need to encourage it anymore. We don't need to subsidize it anymore because people are doing it anyway. But what we learned is that while the migrants are away, there's some seasonal food insecurity during that period, because you wait for the migrant to come back with the money, right? So one thing you can do to help matters is provide people some timed seasonal consumption loans with the understanding that they can pay back when the migrant comes back home, right? So that's something that we have started implementing in Nepal.
I think Jeevan Bania has raised his hand.
So it is back, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, it was just a slight glitch. So there are some people who have raised their hands. So Jeevanji, do you want to ask a question?
Thank you, Sambriddhi, for letting me ask the question. First of all, Professor Mushfiq, thank you very much for taking your time to deliver the lecture today. My name is Jeevan, and I'm also associated with the organizer today, Social Science Baha and CESLAM. A very interesting presentation. We could also have some interesting and comparative perspective on how the COVID situation has further accelerated especially the migrant populations, which are globally considered to be one of the most vulnerable population in the world. In fact, I do have a couple of let's say one question I would say in reference to the point that you made towards the end of your presentation, which is about what you have this reference about what the destination countries really want from the migrant sending countries. I do have a little bit of reservations, let's say, here that already thousands of migrant populations have returned to their respective countries without their adequate salary and benefits and social security and things like that. And there are discussions going around in the destination countries that without guaranteeing these salaries, due salaries, and a payment, it's quite unwise in the part of the migrant sending countries to send, to just decide to send the migrant workers, because it sets certain kind of precedent for the future. That's one thing. And the second thing associated with this would be, if you look at the data of the Bangladesh and Nepal, Nepalese migrant workers are the Nepali and Bangladeshi both are the most vulnerable migrant population especially in Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain. So, without having some kind of protective mechanisms or the guarantee for that, I think it would be quite risky for migrant sending countries like Nepal and Bangladesh to just hurry up and send migrant workers from our country. Because, again, we are talking about the benefits of the migrants here. If we have this problem of people going in the risky situation and returning under the very difficult situation, and it will have some kind of financial implications on the life of the migrant workers as well as for the migrant sending country. So can you just reflect on the points that you made in reference to
Sure.
my questions and observations? Thank you very much.
Sure, no, thank you for that very useful observation. And I should start by saying, the nice comments that you made about our presentation, they should all be directed at Arjun, because he's responsible for all of the data and the good things that I presented. And on your point, the way we have to think about it is that of course, international migration, especially to countries in the Middle East, especially when it is mediated by some intermediaries, some of whom might be fraudulent, right? And then there are employers who behave badly in collaboration with those intermediaries and take advantage of those migrants. Right? These are problems that we've always had, like pre-COVID period and during the COVID period. And that's an area that requires attention always. Okay? But you also have to think about, okay, in spite of all these risks, right? People are desperate to migrate because the economics of it are such that, relative wages in different parts of the world are such that, when it does work out, it's a big deal and a big benefit for those families. I mean, my own family, we went through this period where, my father's generation, I would say my grandfather's generation, we were mostly rural, and my older uncle, they remained mostly rural. My father and younger siblings got an education, moved to the urban area. That changed our family's prospects. And then those guys who got an education, many of them then moved to the United Arab Emirates, right? And that led to money for education for my generation. Okay? So migration does offer a lot of opportunities, and therefore we do need to think carefully about how do we take advantage of those opportunities while mitigating the risks. And for that, perhaps, the types of risks, the new risks that you're talking about here, which is like back wages that haven't been paid, or suddenly migrants are forced to return, right? We need maybe a stronger presence and advocacy by government agencies to do government-to-government type intermediation. And I'll give you one example from a different sector where this was worked out pretty well. So as soon as COVID hit, Bangladesh exports a lot of ready-made garments. So our two main exports are, textiles, garments, and humans. Right? The ready-made garments account for almost 85, 90% of all of our exports now, goods exports. And what happened was, even before COVID, there was a single case of COVID in Bangladesh. Our economy is already affected because the European American buyers who had already been affected by COVID, they weren't ordering anymore. And not only that, they behaved even more poorly, which is that they were refusing to pay for the existing orders and collect and pay for the existing orders, because unfortunately, the contracts are set up such that you produce first and then you get paid. Okay? So Bangladesh, for that month, they had been producing things, and suddenly they're like, no, we're not going to take these orders and we're not paying. And at that point, there was a lot of pressure brought on, through BGME and Bangladesh Government Manufacturer Exporter Association, lobbying, government contacts, media contacts, etc., in order to highlight the issue and the unfairness and the injustice here, right? And that did lead to a lot of the buyers in Europe and America being pressured to then pay. Okay? So I think we need to use, clever, smart strategies like that to bring the right type of diplomatic pressure and media pressure, etc., so that migrant rights are protected to the extent possible. But we can't just resort to, migration is too risky. We can't let Nepalis or Bangladeshis do it, because it's just too important a part of people's livelihoods and our entire economies.
Okay, there are a few questions in the question answer box. I was disconnected for some time, so I don't know which.
Sure. So I did notice a question that's really important. I forget. Oh, there's so many questions. No, I can't find it. But one important one was somebody pointed out. Oh yeah, Sanjay is come from Sanjay Sharma. So Sanjay points out that at the macro level, Nepal is not seeing much of a drop in remittances of only like 0.5%. And in fact, I'll add to Sanjay's point that we are also seeing such a surprising lack of a drop in Bangladesh as well. So you saw in April, there was a big year-on-year drop of 25%. And based on that, the World Bank had projected that this is going to be really bad news, right? But somehow the remittances like kind of pick back up, okay? Now, okay, what is the explanation here? Because we are seeing, like, collecting data at the micro level, at the household level, that migrant families are suffering more and there's a remittance drop. So I mean, first of all, I should say I don't fully have a good answer as to why there would be this discrepancy, but let me give you some possibilities. So one is that this is the most pessimistic possibility, is what's happening is that, if migrants are indeed getting deported back, or they feel like, the destination country is not a good place right now because I'm having a hard time finding work. My employer doesn't want me to come in because of disease risk, right? If those are the issues, right? Then then what might happen is, my phone keeps ringing. I'm gonna just turn it off for a little while. It's very distracting. If those are, if the issues are that like people are getting deported, or that people don't want to stay back because the opportunities aren't there in the destination, then you might see a increase in remittances just from the fact that people have to then liquidate their assets and send it back home in preparation for a return, right? So you might see that, remittances aren't dropping, but that's not actually good news for the long term, because a lot of people are just like being forced to return soon, right? That's the most pessimistic one. Now, another possibility in Bangladesh doesn't apply to Nepal, is that like after COVID, there were 2 Eids, our biggest festivals, and that's a time when a lot of money gets sent. And the Eid period also varies across the year, right? So we just happen to be in a fortunate time when there's a lot of remittances normally coming home anyway. Right? But anyway, it's a good question, and I don't have a full answer for you.
So there are quite a few questions, and I think we are running short of time, but I think I'll allow at least 10 to 15 minutes more, because there's a lot of interest. So maybe I'll just try to summarize the questions in terms of the themes. So a few questions are related to what are the policies that the government should have in terms of reintegration, of the labor migrants into the economy, and what are some of the solutions that can be proposed? I think that's one question that has come up. The other question is on gender, gender and age inequalities. When you collected your data, was there disaggregation by gender? And when we talk about some of the issues such as food insecurity, who answers these questions? So maybe you can touch upon these two broad questions and then we can move on to others.
Okay, so let me, I've already forgotten the first one, so let me go backwards. I'll just answer the second piece and then Sambriddhi, I'll come back and ask you about what I missed, okay? Let me talk about measurement a little bit. I see questions about food insecurity measurement, who's answering questions, etc., and the gender issues. So in terms of food insecurity measurement, so when it's in person, it's much more extensive. In the phone service, it's a little bit more limited. But we ask questions like, there's a series of questions. We ask questions about, for a recall period, which might be 7 days or 14 days in the last couple of weeks. Like how many meals have you had? Have you had to cut back on meals? So either number of meals or a separate question, have you had to cut back on portion sizes, right? Or, when we do more extensive modules, it's about also like, are you cutting back on protein and things like that, right? And then there are separate questions about, what are your worries? Are you worried? Are you having to worry about food or not? Okay. So then a lot of what I showed you in the graphs today was an index on the basis of each of these questions. But like if I were to break up the index into each component, like either worried about food or having to cut back on portion sizes, you see very similar patterns. Okay. And okay, on the gender issues, so generally speaking, the types of migrants that we've been tracking, both in Bangladesh, especially in Bangladesh and somewhat in Nepal as well, but especially in Bangladesh, the internal migrants, they're by and large male. Right? So basically, I mean, the typical household profile you should have in your mind is that there's a male migrant, and then but we're collecting a lot of data from the family remaining behind. So often the question is being answered by the non-migrant members of the family. Okay. Now, so that's the situation in Bangladesh and Nepal, but given that the gender question came up, let me start bringing in some data from Sierra Leone, okay? So to get the gender specific impacts, when you're asking about food, right, in Bangladesh and Nepal, it's difficult for us to get gender specific impacts because it's hard to like look at a pot of rice or chicken or whatever and say, okay, how much did the man eat versus the woman eat? Like those are questions that are not easy for people to answer. Right? In Sierra Leone, it's a bit more possible for us to get more accurate indications of the gendered impacts, because it turns out that in all the households that we are tracking across Sierra Leone, a third of those households are female-headed. Okay, so then the comparison that we end up doing is, how are female-headed households experiencing the crisis, and is it different from the male-headed households? So I'll give you those results, but let me first tell you why are households female-headed. There are two reasons, half and half, 60% each. One is a formerly married person who's widowed or divorced or something like that. And the other half is like currently married, but the husband is away, maybe as a migrant, but it's not so much like the high-frequency seasonal migration, it's longer-term migration. Okay? And okay, so now when I compare female to male-headed households and what's happening during the COVID period, what you observe is that female-headed households are differentially suffering. Okay, so first of all, they're poorer to begin with. Like that was always true in the data even before COVID. But beyond that, what we observe is that they know a lot less about COVID. Okay, so when we do ask open-ended questions about people's knowledge of COVID and the symptoms, etc., female-headed households are less likely to be able to report correctly the symptoms of COVID compared to male-headed households. And there's a very significant difference there. And then we see that the information sources are different. Male-headed households are much more connected to sort of official information sources, whereas female-headed households, they seem to be mostly relying on friends and neighbors for information. The information is different. And then you see their social distancing behavior is not as good either. They're much less likely to be owning masks and using them. Okay? And third, when we ask food insecurity questions for female-headed versus male-headed households, and then here we ask about, are adults eating all the meal, are children eating all the meal, then you see a significant difference where in female-headed households, children are significantly less likely to have gotten all 3 meals in the previous week. Okay? And unfortunately, early on, we're not seeing any excess government attention to female-head households. They're equally likely to report government NGO support during this crisis period. And so where we have cleaner data and ability to distinguish between male and female gendered impacts, we are seeing that women are suffering more. And now what we've added to that, after having documented all of this, we're also now tracking domestic violence. And some colleagues of ours who we've jointly done research with who are tracking this in Kenya, they're finding in Kenya that during this crisis period, there's a sharp increase in sort of domestic violence, and especially like in terms of beating of children and women, but especially children. Okay? So there are, I mean, lots of gendered impacts here for us to worry about, and we're trying to now systematically track these things.
The other set of questions I think have focused a lot on integration. You know, how can migrant workers be reintegrated in the economy, and what sort of social protection policies can, let's say, the government of Nepal adopt?
So the way, I mean, after having documented these results, we started having discussions with BRAC, this, the world's largest NGO. We started in Bangladesh. And BRAC has lots of different programs. Of course, they run, clinics and they run schools, et cetera, but they also have also even before COVID, had kind of like a migrant reintegration division program. Okay? And so we've been discussing with them on, what types of programs are necessary right now, what's going to be helpful. And one of the, so let me tell you about, I mean, there's a lot of things that you can probably guess, like what types of reintegration we'd want, like retraining and so forth, right? So we should be thinking about like standard things like retraining, but let me just use my time to tell you about the surprising thing I learned, which I think will be more surprising to all of you, which is that BRAC mentioned to us even before COVID that a lot of the people who come back, right, an urgent need for them is some mental health support. Okay? So suddenly, so I think it comes from multiple sources. So one is, migrants are living away, they don't have a good like network of friends and social network present in the origin because they've been more disconnected. They come back, they were working and suddenly without work, right? That puts additional mental pressure. And it seems like mental health is an area that requires more attention that I hadn't thought about this before hearing this from the field.
And I think the other set of questions has also been the curiosity that, you talk about shocks of migrant families experiencing more shocks during the COVID time, and some questions related to, so what about agriculture? Did they sell their land? Did they have something to, a backup to rely on? Were they only depending on remittances? That's just some of the questions have been linked to this aspect.
Yeah, so land markets are quite thin here. I mean, so we shouldn't be thinking about buying, selling land as the first strategy. I mean, you could think about liquidating other assets that are easier to liquidate, like you could be selling off cows, right, or some other productive asset like that. So how are people coping? So, we've tracked this across like 15 different countries in Africa, Latin America, and South Asia, and also East Asia, like Philippines. And in terms of coping, the level of government NGO support, right, seems to have been like highly variable across countries or even across populations within the same country. So just as an example, in Bangladesh, I told you that we were tracking that Cox's Bazar, the Rohingya refugee sample. Right? So there was a lot of like great presence of sort of international humanitarian actors there to begin with from 2017 onwards as the genocide was happening in Burma. Right? And so those households report at very high rates, they report getting a lot of support, right? Partly because that infrastructure was also already there, but other populations in Bangladesh reporting much lower rates of getting support. Okay. And then when we asked people, we did ask these questions about exactly how are you coping, right? There was people were more likely to report some support from sort of friends and family members as opposed to official sources. And And have you, I'm forgetting what the answer was for liquidating assets. But there's something else I want to pick up on, that question on what is happening. So when this border closed, especially the India-Nepal border closed, right? Something else that we're observing that is going to make it difficult for people to cope, right? Is that especially in the districts in Nepal that are close to the Indian border, right? They are differentially affected now, because when the border closed, not only did the mobility of people stop, it's also the case that the mobility of goods stopped. So there was a lot of informal trading happening across the border, right? And like, something that others might call smuggling. Okay? Now, a lot of that has stopped. Okay, so now why is that dangerous? So, we know that fertilizer is something that comes over from India because it's cheaper in India, it's produced locally in India. Okay, so now if the informal trading has stopped and less fertilizer is coming in, and fertilizer prices go up, right? That's going to be difficult. Already as it is, the way people are coping, if we are observing that food insecurity is going up, people are cutting back on portion sizes, clearly they're not coping fully, right? But they're going to, of course, prioritize food and consumption first before investment, right? And so what I really worry about is that if this implies that there's less fertilizer investment, that's going to have persistent effects in the next agricultural season, where productivity will be lower because you're not putting the right type of input, right? And on top of that, as I'm saying, that with the border being closed, you have certain types of food items where prices are going up. You have certain types of inputs like fertilizer where prices are going up. Right? That makes it even more difficult for people to cope.
And then there's another question specific on the remittance. So for a country or economy that is remittance driven, what are the possible policy recommendations? Especially these governments themselves are now extremely constrained with reduced inflow of foreign exchange earnings. I think that's a big concern for Nepal. So I don't know if you have positive examples from Bangladesh.
Yeah, so in, Bangladesh, thankfully, now we're talking about more of a macro indicators and situation rather than the micro stuff that we've been discussing at the household level, right? So thankfully, Bangladesh, partly because of the success of the ready-made garment sector over the last 30, 35 years, along with, also international migration remittances. So Bangladesh is in a relatively favorable balance of payment situation in terms of like the foreign exchange reserves, right? The country in South Asia that has to worry most about this is Pakistan. Okay? Pakistan, the situation is actually much worse than in Nepal. Bangladesh's situation, I would say, is probably better than in Nepal. Okay? And that also has, now if you're talking macro, let me just, I was trying to focus on the micro data, but let me now, wave my hand and start talking about big things that I understand very little about. That once you get into this type of balance of payments situation, like Pakistan, for example, is now a lot more dependent on their trading partners and investment partners. They're a lot more dependent on China. Okay, and that has effects on in a lot of dimensions in economics and politics and life. So, for example, Pakistan is not able to say anything about something that's happening like right north of their border in Xinjiang province in China, where there's a genocide against Uyghur Muslims, right? So Pakistan is like completely quiet about that because they're that dependent on China. Okay? So these are, like there are these immediate effects that we think about when where at the macro sense, we lose foreign exchange reserves, but there are also like deep fundamental effects on the position of countries, their geopolitical situation, and the decisions that they're having to make in the future. And Nepal, we know, has been, affected in the past based on this tussle between, are we closer to China, are we closer to India, and India putting pressure on Nepal by, say, for example, reducing access to ports. We all probably remember the fuel crisis, right? I remember not even being able to get momos during the fuel crisis because nobody wanted to make them because it took too much fuel. Anyway, so Nepal also has to be very careful about this because dependence on either China or India is puts Nepal in a much more vulnerable situation.
Yeah, I think finally, just this whole question on the employment in the home country, and when lots of workers started coming back initially, they were very optimistic, saying that if there was employment, I would stay. And recently I read in the news, people are going back to India now, because they don't have anything here. There hasn't been any relief, and government actually hasn't been proactive at all. So one worker actually said that if somebody gives me a job right now, I'll just turn right back, and so this whole issue of, how can employment actually be generated? We didn't see that a lot after the earthquake either. And even after the border, after India is blocked, So I think these questions are burning questions for all Nepalis now with the COVID. But with that said, I think I have to close the keynote now because it's almost 10. Went over a little bit because there's so much interest. I really like to thank Professor Mobarak for your valuable time and very informative keynote address, because we've been intuitively talking about these things. People do know these things are happening, but actually seeing data support this is very important, and to be able to map the numbers, I think, is also very important. And I don't know if you have a last few words, then I think I would call this a close.
Sure, I'll just say thank you again to CESLAM for organizing this, and not only for organizing this particular session, but your long-term collaboration that allows us to collect this data and get all this work done. And Arjun in particular has been a frequent collaborator of ours, and the last time we met was in Kathmandu, but before that we had really nice like brainstorming sessions in Pokhara. I hope that we can return to a world where I get to go back to beautiful parts of Nepal again. And to the audience, lots of really good questions that I couldn't all answer well, but thank you very much. And I'm happy to engage more by email and get your questions, and maybe people from our team can answer.
Yeah, finally, I'd like to thank all the participants. We had, I think, at one point I saw 117, and even now they're around like 78 participants, and there's a lot of interest. And maybe if some of your questions were not answered, you can email Professor Mobarak if you have some burning questions. And with that, I'd really like to thank everybody once again, and CESLAM and Social Science Baha for organizing this. And thank you and good night.
Thank you.